Combat has played a huge role in Minecraft's success, but how does it actually work? I spent 100 hours researching the source code of Minecraft to unlock the secrets, strategies, and mechanics behind PvP, and maybe I'll even help you get better at it. The first time we ever saw combat in Minecraft was September 1st, 2009, Survival Test. This update added the first mobs to the game, but more importantly, health. In Minecraft, you have 10 hearts, but if you think about how you can take half a heart of damage, we can think of those as 20 half hearts, and that's how your health is stored in the code. Each time you take damage, this number goes down. You don't want your health to go down, much like we don't want my sub count to go down. Subscribe to secure your place below 20k in our race to become the #1 Thomas on YouTube. Sorry for derailing the conversation. The next mechanic I'm going to talk about is reach. This mechanic changes slightly, depending on if you're in creative or survival mode, but I'll assume you clicked on this video because you care about survival combat. In Minecraft, you can either be hovering over an entity or not. If you left click while hovering over an entity, you hit that entity. If not, you don't. Seems pretty simple until you realize that hovering over an entity doesn't just mean having your crosshair over them. When doing the calculations to find out if you're hovering over an entity, Minecraft draws what is essentially a big box in the world, coming out of your player. In survival, this box is actually 4.5 blocks large, but that's just to make sure that it gets entities that might be more than 3 blocks away, with the part of their hitbox being closer than that. It then checks whether a line coming out of your eyes in the direction you're looking intercepts with their hitbox. If it does, and they're the hitbox closest to you, then that entity moves on to the final check. If you're in survival mode, is the part of the hitbox you hit further than 3 blocks away? If it is, you miss the entity and pretty much nothing happens. If it's closer than 3 blocks, that's now the entity you're hovering over and the fun can begin. When you click your mouse in this state, the client registers that you hit the entity, telling the server and starting the next phase. Did you catch it? Let's go back a second. There. The line is drawn in the direction you're looking, out of your eyes. As Technoblade puts it,
bam. I've knocked him onto the ledge, this is huge. The reach you can hit people from begins at the player's eyes, so when Dream is a block higher than me, it's much easier for me to hit his feet than for him to hit my head because the base of a right triangle is shorter than the hypotenuse. Stay in school, kids. It makes you better at PvP.
To illustrate that in video format, the angle that you look at people to hit them matters a lot. To hit people from the furthest possible distance, you want to keep your head as straight as possible. Looking up or looking down actually makes your effective reach shorter. So if a player's 1 block above you, you don't want to look at their head or their body, but instead at their feet, maximizing the distance you can hit them from. This is by far the most useful tip for combat in Minecraft. The number of fights you'll win is crazy, but there's still a bunch more to come. Now that we understand how reach works, let's move on to our next topic, damage. This mechanic is different depending on if you're playing with pre or post 1.9 PvP, so I'll go through both separately. Old PvP. To start, I'm going to talk in terms of damage points, and for an unarmored player with no potion effects, this is just the number of health points you'll take away from someone when you hit them. In Minecraft, every entity deals a certain amount of damage. Like, when an Enderman hits you, you'll take more damage than if a zombie hits you, for example. Minecraft calculates these using something called attributes and attribute modifiers, which are used for many other things in the game, but right now we're interested in the attack damage attribute. Players have this attribute too, and Minecraft modifies it based on a few factors, like what item you're holding or what potion effects you have. So every player starts off with a base attack damage attribute value of 1. Minecraft then checks if you have anything that should add to this base value, making your hits stronger by default. In 1.8.9, there are 4 types of items that can do this: shovels, pickaxes, axes, and swords. If you're holding any shovel in your hand, you immediately have 1 extra damage. Any pickaxes 2, axes 3, and swords add 4 extra damage. The next check is what material the item is made out of. Wooden and gold items add nothing, stone adds 1, iron 2, and emerald 3. Wait, emerald? Yep, that's how Minecraft refers to diamond tools. I'd say I bet that led to confusion when they added villager emeralds into the game, but knowing what else happened that update, it was probably the least of their worries. Go watch my video about that if you don't know what I'm talking about. Adding all this together, if you're a player holding a sword made of diamonds, that's 1 plus 4 plus 3, giving you a total of 8 attack damage. Enough to one-shot sheep. The last modifier that is processed in this step is whether or not you've been affected by a potion of weakness. If you have, you lose 0.5 damage for every level you have, meaning weakness 2 removes 1 damage, and weakness 10 would remove 5. After processing any modifiers that add or remove from the base value, it checks if there are any modifiers that multiply that value. The only way to achieve this in vanilla is by having a strength potion applied. This adds 130% damage for each level, which means strength 1 multiplies your damage by 2.3, and strength 2 multiplies it by 3.6. A very powerful potion effect, especially if you already have a high base value here. The result after all this is stored as the very unhelpful, obfuscated variable name F, but we can refer to it as normal attack damage. Notably, the game will modify this once more if this flag is true. This actually checks if your hit was a critical hit, and if it was, you do 50% more on top of that. So, if a hit was going to do 8 attack damage, but you critical hit your enemy, you do 12 instead. But remember our lesson from before, if your opponent is above you, it's very easy to get into a situation where you can hit them and they can't hit you back. So oftentimes trying to critical hit a decent player isn't worth the risk of being locked into a combo. The last step in damage calculation is simply enchantments. These add on to the final value, after everything, including critical damage boost, has been calculated. Sharpness adds 1.25 times the sharpness level damage points against all enemies, and Smite or Bane of Arthropods add 2.5 times their level, but only against a mob of that type. Completely useless against players, but interestingly it's additive against those mobs if you somehow illegally have one of those enchants and sharpness on the same tool. Do with that information as you please. Just to give a quick example of how this works then, let's say you're a player with a Sharpness 3 Iron Sword, you have the Strength 1 potion effect, and you're critical hitting. You do 7 damage, multiplied by Strength 1, add 50% for a crit hit, and then add 3.75 for Sharpness 3. You'll deal a total of 27.9 damage points. Got it? Good. Moving on. Damage taken, old PvP. Now, for a player with no armor or potion effects, the damage you see is the damage you get. But how often are you fighting players with no armor and no potions? Even mobs have these sometimes. No! So let's talk about how that affects things. In this version, before shields were added to the game, Minecraft had a similar mechanic, known as blocking. While you can't attack while you're blocking, you can however attack and then block instantly after, or block and then release the block key to attack. This is known colloquially as block hitting. But I'll get into some of the other benefits of that later. Blocking adds 1 damage point to the damage taken and cuts it in half. So, if you were going to take 9 points of damage, you'd only take 5. If you were going to take 10, it's now reduced to 5.5. The next mechanic Minecraft considers is armor. Each armor piece has a damage reduction value, which is based on these somewhat arbitrary numbers. Adding those numbers together linearly reduces the amount of damage you take up to a max of 25, which would completely negate all damage. So, let's say you have a full set of diamond armor, which is 20 damage reduction points. An attack that would normally do 10 damage would now only do 2 damage, or a single heart. You can apply this to any other combination of damage and figure out exactly how much you'd take. Also, good to note is that your armor each loses a quarter of the initial damage's durability, regardless of how many pieces you're actually wearing, with a minimum of 1 durability. So, if you took 16 points of damage, each armor piece loses 4 durability. But if you only took 1 point of damage, each armor piece still takes 1 point of durability. Unbreaking just adds a 20 or 27 or 30% chance, depending on the level, that each damage point won't actually decrease the durability. That's Minecraft's armor calculation over, but you'll notice I didn't mention the protection enchantments. That's because this doesn't actually take place during the armor phase, but instead during the next step, the potion phase. The resistance potion effect works in a similar way to armor. You multiply the level by 5, divide that by 25, and that's how much of the damage you negate. That means resistance 5 negates all damage, and resistance 1 negates just 20%. After checking for resistance, the game now checks for any protection enchantments, broken down into 5 categories: all, fire, fall, explosion, and projectile. The base damage modifier for each enchantment is 6 plus level squared over 3. Then depending on the type, that is either reduced or increased by these values. That means that regular protection is much less effective than any of these specialized enchantments. If you're looking to protect against explosions, you'll be twice as safe with blast protection rather than regular. Next, we add the result together for each enchantment on each item, which means, yes, if you get an illegal Prot 5, Projectile Protection 5 item, they will stack together. The game then makes sure these numbers are between 0 and 25, and multiplies it randomly by 50 to 100%. For example, if the result was 22, it would return a random number between 11 and 22. Now, After it calculates this damage modifier for all your armor pieces, it caps it at 20, then does the familiar step of dividing it by 25, and, well, that's the damage you take. If you got the max value of 20, you'd take 80% less damage. Running some numbers for you, Protection 1 on one piece of armor is 1 damage modifier points, and would result in a 4% reduction in damage taken, whereas Protection 2 is 2 damage modifier points, and results in a 4 to 8% reduction. Prot 4 is 5 damage modifier points, and results in a 12 to a 20% reduction in damage taken. And having more than one armor piece just adds them together. Hopefully I didn't lose you there, because that was a lot of maths. The key takeaway here is that Protection doesn't care about the armor's material or type, it has the same impact regardless. New PvP. As we all know, after 1.9, Mojang added cooldowns to attacks, to try and save Minecraft players from a much worse enemy than the Ender Dragon, Carpal Tunnel. As a result, finding out how much damage you do is a trickier process. They also added a new attribute modifier, attack speed, which changes how fast you can swing with each tool. So, to begin, Minecraft, like earlier, calculates your attack damage from your attack damage attribute, but they changed all the values around and added a new item. So shovels, pickaxes, axes and swords add to your attack damage, but so do tridents. But that's honestly not much of a surprise. However, previously in game, it would show how much attack damage they added to your attacks, but now they show the amount of damage your attacks do in total. So, for example, a diamond sword used to add 7 damage to your attack, meaning you deal 8 damage points, but now you only deal 7, meaning the diamond sword is only adding 6 damage to your attack. The new addition values for the weapons are that pickaxes add 1, shovels 1.5, swords 3, axes 6, and tridents 8. The material values are the same as before, so wood and gold add 0, stone 1, iron 2, diamond 3, but now netherite also exists, adding 4. Taking an example, like before, holding a netherite sword means that you're effectively dealing 1 plus 3 plus 4, 8 damage total, just as it shows in game. The weakness effect also works completely differently. Now it takes away 4 damage points per level. Wait, what? Huh. I guess that means that with just weakness 1, you can't actually do damage to any mob with even a wooden sword. The strength effect was also reworked. It is now an additive effect rather than multiplicative. Each level adds 3 damage points. So a strength 2 diamond sword hit now does 13 damage points rather than 28.8. Next, as normal, the game calculates your enchantment damage bonus. However, this also works a little differently. Sharpness, instead of adding 1.25 damage per level, adds 1 damage at level 1, and then another 0.5 damage for each level afterwards. Smite and Bane of Arthropods still work the same as before. Once the normal attack damage and enchant damage have been calculated, we get onto the fun bit, attack speed. This is an attribute, just like attack damage, which means we add, subtract, or multiply it to find your actual attack speed. The player's base attack speed, meaning with no tools, is 4. To ground what that number means to you, the time it takes to reset your attack is 1 over attack speed seconds. So an attack speed of 4 means your cooldown only takes a quarter of a second, or 5 50 millisecond ticks. As a real world clock ticks once per second, Minecraft's clock ticks 20 times per second, meaning that one tick takes 50 milliseconds. Anyway, from the base attack speed of 4, the tools each subtract some attack speed, with the higher tools subtracting less. There isn't a set amount like with the attack damage, these are just arbitrary numbers picked for each material of each tool. For example, a diamond pickaxe, subtracting 2.8 attack speed from our 4 attack speed base, that means we're left with 1.2 attack speed, exactly what is shown in game. This means your cooldown resets in 1 over 1.2, roughly 0.83 seconds. After the addition, there are 2 multiplicative changes to attack speed, haste and mining fatigue. Each level of haste makes you swing 10% faster, and each level of mining fatigue makes you swing 10% slower, and this affects combat too. So, once your attack speed has been calculated, the game finds out how long you have left until your cooldown, or if you've passed it. Each tick, your attack strength ticker increases by 1, and when you use or switch items, it resets back to 0. The game calculates what fraction of the way you are through your cooldown by dividing the number of ticks since your last attack by how long your cooldown should take, capped at 1. Now it has this fraction, which is a number between 0 and 1, representing how far through your cooldown you've been. Your enchantment damage gets multiplied by it. However, it also takes that same progress fraction, squares it, multiplies it by 0.8, and adds it to 0.2. This produces a graph that looks like this, which it multiplies your normal attack damage by. Like before, we also check for a critical hit, but this time it also makes sure you aren't sprinting. If you're sprinting, it won't count as a critical hit, and you don't get the 50% normal attack damage increase. After this check, Both the normal and enchantment damage values are combined. Next, if you're not sprinting, you don't jump for a critical hit, and you're holding a sword, you'll perform a sword sweep. Without the Sweeping Edge enchantment, this inflicts a single point of damage to all other mobs within a 1 block radius of your target's hitbox. The Sweeping Enchant, however, means that you inflict a portion of your damage to your target according to this formula. So Sweeping Edge 1 inflicts half your damage, Level 2 is 2/3 of your damage, and Sweeping Edge 3 inflicts 75% of your damage to all the targets in the radius. Damage taken, new PvP. This has changed quite a bit, but one of the most important parts to know is that blocking has changed. You can now block attacks with a shield. Shields are bypassed by a bunch of damage types, but the main player inflicted ones are arrows shot from a crossbow with piercing, or, well, a potion effects. After right clicking, the shield takes 5 ticks, or 250 milliseconds, before it can block any damage. Once it's up, it blocks any non-exempt incoming damage within an 180-degree cone of vision in front of the player. If the shield blocks more than 3 damage points, it takes them, rounded up, as durability. However, if the attacker's held item was an axe, regardless of if the attack was charged up or not, the shield is then disabled for 100 ticks, 5 seconds. Onto the actual damage taken. The way that damage affects armor durability has thankfully stayed the same, but the amount of damage that armor absorbs hasn't. There's now another attribute called armor toughness. Luckily, in vanilla, the only materials that have a toughness value that isn't 0 are diamond and netherite. To calculate the amount of damage you take now, we have the same division by 25 as before. However, the number that we're dividing by 25 has changed a little. We take the total armor damage reduction values as before, but then we take away the damage inflicted, divided by 2 plus toughness over 4. Using an example, iron armor has a total damage reduction of 15, just like before. But now say we're dealing 8 points of damage. Instead of dividing 15 by 25, as earlier, we instead take 4 away from that, meaning that our final reduction amount is instead 11 over 25, blocking 44% of the damage. With diamond armor in the same scenario, we block 67.2% of the damage. With netherite, we'd block 68.4% of the damage. Not a big difference, but you can see that netherite is slightly better, even though it has the same damage reduction values. Resistance works exactly the same, thankfully, but protection is different again. They instead return enchant modifiers. Protection is just its level, fire is double its level, fall is triple its level, and explosion and projectile double their levels. So, for example, 4 pieces of protection 4 armor returns 16, but 4 blast protection 4 armor pieces gives 32. That number is then clamped between 0 and 20, which, interestingly enough, means that more than 3 pieces of any enchant except regular protection is overkill, and then it uses the division by 25. So that means a full set of prot 4 removes 64% of damage, 16% per piece, right in the middle of the old 12 to 20% chance. Now that that's out of the way, both versions work pretty similarly for the next topic, aside from a couple additions. Knockback. Right off the bat, there are 2 types of knockback. There's plain old damage knockback, that you'll inflict upon someone even if you're standing still, but there's also special knockback from a player attack. The first type of knockback is pretty easy to explain, but to understand it, you'll need to know how movement works in Minecraft. Just like in real life, entities don't just teleport from one place to another. They have a velocity, which, if you think back to your high school physics class, is just another word for speed, except it can go below 0. And over time, their velocity turns into their actual positions. It's just like speed equals distance over time. Bringing this into Minecraft's tick system, the velocity is represented by 3 numbers: motion X, motion Y, and motion Z. Once a tick, your player is moved by these 3 numbers. So if motion X is 0.1, you move towards positive X, also known as east, 1/10 of a block. After you move, these numbers are then changed based on the friction of the world around you. By default, your X and Z coordinates are reduced based on air resistance and the slipperiness of the blocks you're stood on. All blocks, except slime and ice, have the same slipperiness value of 0.6, and therefore reduce your velocity by 40%. Air resistance, or the base friction, is 0.91, reducing your velocity by 9% each tick. These 2 stack multiplicatively, so that when you're on the ground, you lose 45.4% of your velocity each tick. Your height works a little differently. Each tick, you accelerate 0.08 blocks towards the ground, but this is also reduced by 98%, giving you a graph that looks something like this, and a terminal velocity of 3.92 meters per tick. This does mean that even when you're on a block, you're constantly accelerating towards it and then having your acceleration reset back to 0. Now that we understand how movement works, let's look at damage knockback. When an entity takes a hit of damage, Minecraft first checks where the damage came from, relative to the entity. It doesn't care about height and just sees what the difference in X and Z values are. It then halves its current motion and adds 0.4 blocks of motion in the opposite direction of the hit using some vector maths. For height knockback, it adds a constant 0.4 blocks of upwards velocity, which means, thanks to gravity, it will hit the ground 10 ticks later. Interestingly, this means that with normal knockback, you can't hit an entity over a 1-block wall. This graph shows how far and how high they'll go with normal knockback. This one shows what happens if you hit them again as soon as you're able. The next type of knockback is more interesting. If you're sprinting, well, if the server thinks you're sprinting, that'll be important in a minute, you inflict another type of knockback on the entity. This too sends them flying in the opposite direction of your hit, adding another 0.5 blocks of velocity horizontally. It also adds 0.1 blocks of velocity upwards, meaning that they'll travel along this curve instead, notably allowing you to hit them over a 1-block high wall. This is a big difference, and it's exaggerated further when you consider that you can hit them again before they hit the ground, resulting in this curve. That's really interesting, except in vanilla Minecraft there's a bug, known as a desync. Basically, when you hit a mob while sprinting, the server cancels your sprint and tells you about it. However, if you're using your sprint key, the client never tells the server that you started sprinting again after this, so your next hit counts as if you weren't sprinting at all. I'll be making a video going more in detail about this bug soon, so subscribe if you want to see that. But the way to avoid it is by doing something known as sprint resetting. If you've ever heard of block hitting or W tapping to make you better at PvP, this is why. It means your client actually tells the server that you started sprinting again, so your next hit counts as a sprint hit and deals the extra knockback. Aside from being able to knock players off much easier in Bed Wars, since sprint hitting people makes them fly higher up, you can use this to a huge combat advantage. This graph shows that the average height of your enemy is roughly 1.1 blocks off the ground, meaning that if they're correctly aiming for your head, they have an effective reach of only 2.8 blocks. This means that when they do hit you back, they can't hit you again until you come back within 2.8 blocks, whereas you can hit them 3 blocks away. This is further exaggerated if you can hit them across a wall, since you'll become within 3 blocks long before they get back within 2.8 blocks of you, especially if their latency is higher. If they didn't pay attention in their Pythagoras lesson, however, and are trying to hit your body, they'd need to be within 2.14 blocks to hit you. A huge advantage for you. Just in case you were wondering about enchantments, each level of knockback on your sword adds another 0.5 blocks of velocity, just like sprint hitting. Being hit by thorns results in regular knockback, as if the person you attack just hit you. In new PvP, each piece of netherite armor reduces your knockback velocity taken by 10%, and Sweeping Edge deals an additional 0.4 blocks of knockback velocity, and knockback height works a little differently. If you're on the ground, the maximum upwards knockback velocity that you can have is 0.4 blocks per tick. If you're in the air, attacks don't change your vertical velocity at all, so chaining sprint combos together doesn't work as well. One last topic I want to cover before moving on to range attacks: Invulnerability Ticks. I hinted at this during the last segment, but essentially, once you've hit an entity, you can't hit them again for another 10 ticks, half a second. If you hit them with a stronger attack than the first in that time, it will reduce their health, but no knockback will be inflicted. Note that this doesn't mean clicking more than twice a second is useless. If you have any latency between yourself and the server, you should click a little bit earlier, otherwise you'll end up being late and missing out on potential damage. In 1.8, this is why fast clicking methods are so handy, since timing those hits to be perfectly 10 ticks after the last is pretty tricky. In newer PvP, this matters a lot less, since you'll probably be waiting for your weapon to recharge, but it's good to know anyway. Ranged attacks. When you fire an arrow from a bow, it isn't affected by gravity like you and I. Here's the downward speed an arrow will pick up compared to a mob or player. Using this information, we can actually find out exactly how high you need to aim to hit a target any distance away, and we can also see that your arrow will never travel farther than 118 blocks away. Have you noticed that your arrows don't go where you aim them? Well, that's because Minecraft adds randomness into its calculations, making you miss. This means your arrow can fire in the wrong direction, either vertically or horizontally, by, well, technically it could fire in any direction it likes, but it will only be off by more than a degree in any direction, 0.7% of the time. That can still make a big difference though. If you're firing at a target 60 blocks away, it can end up a block above, below, or to the side of where it should have gone. At least that's how it used to work. but in new PvP, it's actually slightly more accurate and will never be more than 0.8 degrees off course. That's refreshing. They actually buffed arrows. One of the most interesting things about arrows is how the damage calculation works. The arrows have a base damage, which is normally 2, but increases by 1 if you have the power enchantment, and then another half a point for each level afterwards. This base damage is then multiplied by the speed that the arrow is travelling. So normally, you do the most damage, multiplying your base damage by 3, from right next to a player. But if you shoot an arrow straight down, gravity speeds it up so much that it can quadruple the base damage. Next, if you fully charge the bow before you shot the arrow, it will randomly deal up to an additional half the damage plus 1. If your shot is doing 6 damage, but you fully charged it, it could do up to 10. This is what that arrow trail represents, whether the arrow was critically charged. As for knockback, the arrow deals normal damage knockback like we talked about earlier, unless your bow is enchanted with punch. In that case, it'll add an additional 0.6 blocks of velocity to its target for each level of punch you have, which is more than a sprint hit. One funny thing I found out about arrows is, you know how arrows will stick out of a player after you shoot them? Yeah, those are just random. The only thing the game stores is how many arrows you have stuck out of you, not where they came from. They last between 20 and 600 ticks, disappearing faster the more arrows you have sticking out of you. There are a few other interesting tidbits I discovered about the rest of combat, especially when it comes to networking and lag. But if I were to include them all here, this video would last for hours, so if you learned something, subscribe.